Well, she no longer graduated. She's Japanese by Aiken, but she's finishing up in museum studies this year. Another friend who just started there.
Hi, I'm Dana Levin. Thank you so much, Lannan Foundation, for Poetry Sundays, where we don't have to listen in competition with espresso machines and other kinds of ambient noise. This is an incredibly beautiful, open, airy, intimate space in which to hear poetry. It is a great gift. So thank you for that. And thank you for bringing Adrian Matejka, who I will talk about in a second. And thanks to all of you for coming on this beautiful day. People and history are very alive in the work of Adrian Matejka. In his second book, Mixology, winner of a 2008 National Poetry Series Prize, Matejka offers poems engaging personages as diverse and time-stretched as William S. Burroughs, Gaudi, the famed modernist Spanish architect, Nigerian Afrobeat musician Fela Kuti, and James Byrd Jr., the victim of the infamous Jasper, Texas dragging. Many of the poems are dedicated to someone, Flavor Flav, of Public Enemy, for those of us who listen to rap, Stacy, who I'm assuming is your partner, and Charles Mingus, who I hope we all know. And you get the sense that in Mixology, Matejka, in addition to blending and bending fixed notions of race, identity, and cultural value, feels into and beyond borders of geography and time. History and culture are personal forces. There's a natural intimacy with which Matejka sings about and through people famous and common, living or ghost. That's no mean thing if you've ever tried to write through historical personages or have read poems that try to do the same. Oftentimes the figures feel like little emblems that the poet's pushing around, but I always feel like in Matejka's poems that these are living, breathing presences. This personalizing impulse drives the virtuosic tales of Jack Johnson, related mostly by his champion self, in Matejka's indelible third collection, The Big Smoke. A finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, The Big Smoke, published in 2013, chronicles the life of that early 20th century boxing phenomenon, otherwise known in the press of the time as, in a poem that Matejka gives us in the book, the Big Ethiopian, the Galveston Giant, and yes, the Big Smoke. Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world. Crowned in 1908, he held the title for 7 years, punching his way through Jim Crow America and a succession of white mistresses and wives. Throughout The Big Smoke, Matejka is attuned to the ironies and paradoxes of power and prestige for Champion Jack, a proud and charismatic black fighter so good white fighters would invoke the color line in order not to fight him. One of the brilliant strokes of The Big Smoke is the way Matejka evokes Johnson's life and mind. Johnson regales us with tales of the ring, bringing us up close to boxing's dance and jab. And I just want to read a couple of moments that do that. In the ring, Frank followed me like I was the one who ran off with his wife. When I clinch a man, it's like being swaddled in forgiveness. When I hook a man, it's like being hit by frustration. I named the punch after the first woman I loved, Clara. No man met my Clara and was still standing to talk about it. Belle, if you'd just do what you're told, I wouldn't have cut my knuckle on your eye tooth. The reader comes away with the vivid sense that despite Johnson's yarn spin and boasts, his fists were his primary expressive tool, in the ring, on the street, and bringing peril to the bedroom. In Matejka's poems, Jack Johnson both absorbs and transcends emblem, dancing with and around polarized identities foisted upon him, from Texas watermelon pickaninny to champion of the Negro world. And in doing this, he gains his essential stance, that of a flawed and gifted man. Adrian Matejka was born in Nuremberg, Germany, and grew up in California and Indiana. He is a graduate of Indiana University and the MFA program at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. His first collection of poems, The Devil's Garden, won the 2002 New York, New England Award from Alice James Books. His second collection, Mixology, was a finalist for the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literature Poetry. His most recent book, The Big Smoke, was awarded the 2014 Anisfield Wolf Book Award, and as I mentioned before, it was a finalist for the 2013 National Book Award and the 2014 Pulitzer Prize. Oh my God. I bet you were like, oh my God. He is a winner of the Julia Peterkin Award and recipient of 2 Illinois Arts Council Literary Awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Lannan Foundation. His work has appeared in American Poetry Review, the Best American Poetry 2010, Gulf Coast, Plowshares Poetry, tons of other journals and anthologies. He teaches in the MFA program at Indiana University in Bloomington. He is currently working on a new collection of poems and a graphic novel. It is my pleasure and excitement to welcome Adrian Matejka.
That's exactly what I was like. I was like, what's happened? Oh, thank you, Dana, for that. And thanks so much for sharing your afternoon with me. I was outside earlier, so I know it was a challenge to make the choice to come in and listen to poetry. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Camille, and Lannan Foundation. I realized when I was preparing for my flight that basically everything that I've written in the last 7 years has somehow been influenced by and supported by the Lannan Foundation. So it's a real honor to be here. For those of you that don't know, Lannan supports and just recently really saved the National Poetry Series, which published Mixology. So there's that. And I started my new book, which I'm going to read from, while I was at the Lannan Foundation residency in Marfa. And I finished The Big Smoke while I was there. So there's this kind of continuum. It feels really good to be here to share these poems with you. They've been good anyway, but it's particularly special for me. I thought I would start by reading some poems from Mixology and then transition into some of the poems that are going to be in my new book, and then I'd finish with poems from The Big Smoke. Thank you again. So Mixology is, I don't know, I wanted to be a rapper when I was a kid, and I was really bad at it. And somewhere along the way, I heard Yusuf Komunyakaa read poetry, and I thought, whatever that guy's doing, I want to do that. And so I brought this sense of enthusiasm for language from rap music into poetry, and Mixology kind of, in a lot of ways, I think, is the manifestation of that. This is a poem called 7 Days of Falling. And I mentioned a couple of people that I need to make sure we understand so we're all on the same page, otherwise the poem doesn't make sense anyway, but it really won't make sense if you aren't familiar with these allusions. Danny LaRusso is the name of the original Karate Kid, like Ralph Macchio in the 1984 movie. His name was Danny LaRusso. And Juan Valdez, does that name ring a bell? Because I hate to try to explain who Juan Valdez is. He's sombrero, ridiculous stereotype. But I had a friend in college who made these T-shirts with Juan Valdez on them with a power fist. And I always thought that was great. So it pops up in the poem. 7 Days of Falling. Today I'm assimilating like margarine into hotcakes. I'm getting down like Danny LaRusso after the Against the Rules leg sweep. So low, I'll be a flower in common decency's lapel. Factual the way Zanzibar means sea of blacks to anyone who isn't from there. Where is Juan Valdez and his Burroughs dependability when you need him? I had a homie who printed T-shirts with Juan front and center, an afro instead of a sombrero, a power fist in place of a smile, the inscription 100% Colombian. I'm going the way of skin, radio waves and thoughts like ear-to-ear transmissions grounded from the mindless space to forgetful earth. Man, my skin, it doesn't need me any more than mold needs cheese. On this day, as cellophane lunchboxes and hand grenades reshaping my palms into their own militaristic orbit, there were only oceans to catch me. On this day, something needs to catalog me, a hall monitor doubled wide by ambition, a goldfish with thumbs hitchhiking toward a fishbowl full of dub. Probably doesn't sound like this, but that poem has a lot to do with the first Iraq War in my head, or rather the second one, W's war. I was writing that and writing against it the whole time, but I don't know, I admire political poets You know, the kind of poets that get right behind it and they say, you know what, that's ridiculous. But I've never been good like that. Like when I say it, it sounds just like that. That's ridiculous. You know? And who wants to read that poem, right? This is as close as I ever got to being that overt politically. This is a poem called Affirmative Action. And I wrote it the day that the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action in the universities, starting with Michigan. I think it was probably 2004. Affirmative action. I'm caught in a bouquet of skin and hair, slaves up and down my blood like a boot in mud, a constellation of almost haves and never news pointing north. That's why my child has a handful of oceans and warped wood, shaken like dice. Hopscotch lips, double-ply knees, on the one hand, sand and spit. On the other, a coffle of spiders eating under a split-fist moon. Free means artifice. Free means being free of this. Free means standing on a stanchion of jive, blackface or otherwise. And if I would have gone back now, I would say that's dedicated to Clarence Thomas, who apparently didn't need affirmative action at all to get where he was. You mentioned Flavor Flav. For those who don't know who Flavor Flav is, he was the clown in Public Enemy, which was a very important and seminal rap group for me coming up. And so I'm going to read a poem that doesn't involve Flavor, but involves seeing Public Enemy for the first time. It's weird sometimes to think about rap music in this new sphere where it's on the radio all the time. But when I was coming up, it wasn't on the radio. You couldn't buy it at the record store. In Indianapolis, there was one place where you could get 45s once in a while. The rest of it we got on third-generation recordings, for those of you who remember tapes, where somebody would dub the tape, and they'd dub it again, and then dub it again, and we'd get that version, like the third or fourth version. And that's how I first heard Public Enemy and Run DMC. But by the late 80s, they started touring, and so they came to Indianapolis. And I got to see them in a community center that they use for bingo. And so it was called the Tyndall Armory, and that's the name of this poem. Tyndall Armory. Public Enemy had no idea of what to do on stage in 1987, but we didn't know what to do as a rap crowd either. Attendance was mandatory, jammed into the Tyndall Armory one night after amateur boxing and one night before bingo. A bunch of homeboys kentayed together with African medallions and graffiti spray paint jeans, all of us mad at the conspiracy of conspiracy, staring each other down with a circular anger only black men can justify. Terminator X, his one-handed power fist cut and scratch already perfected, was the only thing keeping the revolution from starting right there. Bass lines and warning sirens transformed into samples, refusing the WAP like the black maitre d' at the Highlands Country Club refused to seat black people. My friend Richard was determined to be the first black president. He refused wine coolers and weed, white women and white lines because the man could hold anything against him during a campaign. As president, he would buy Highlands and turn it into a black thing. Terminator X had Rich Ray to say peace to the presidency and Nat Turner the first patch of white he saw. And when Chuck D mugged the stage, his African medallions swinging like left hooks, his baseball cap pulled down so low his eyes were the idea of eyes, the heat in that room was enough to make any Tom reconsider his friendships. I mentioned my buddy Richard. I don't think he wants to be the first black president anymore. Now that he's seen what that entails, I think he's like, yeah, no, you're good, President Obama. You can keep that. Maybe I'll read just two more from Mixology. I want to read a poem that was inspired by something that happened around that same time. I imagine most of you know who Spike Lee is. And I had the great experience, I wouldn't say pleasure, but it was a great experience of meeting him when I was about 15 years old. And so this is called Do the Right Thing, after his movie. Spike Lee is so small, I didn't even see him at first, surrounded by black expo goers like a gumdrop in a fist. When I asked him to sign my Free South Africa t-shirt, he said, "You didn't buy that at this booth." Fresh off seeing Do the Right Thing, I crowed, "What's that got to do with your movie, Spike?" His fans laughed, so he edited me like my name was Pino. "Why you care? You ain't even black." Someone behind me said, "Damn, Spike, that ain't right." But Spike's shame scribble on my t-shirt didn't change the missed free throw feeling in my chest. Spike Lee. So the reason I wanted to read that is because that T-shirt became this crazy totem for me. And I didn't realize it until after I wrote this book. That T-shirt, this T-shirt that Spike Lee signed that I refused to wear because I was so ashamed of how that experience went down. Because, you know, afterward I was doing the, well, what I should have said was, you know, but what kind of thing does a 14-year-old have to say to that? My first thought was, wow, he's kind of, I guess he's right. But now, if I met him now, I'd have a whole other kind of dialectic for him. I say that, but that's probably not true. Probably if I met him now, I'd be like, hey, Spike Lee, will you sign my T-shirt again? But for the sake of this reading, I'll act like I'm tough, right? So this is a poem called This Be the First, because after I met Spike and he was so unfortunate, I decided that what I really wanted to be was a grumpy old British guy like Philip Larkin. And his poem, you know, his poem, This Be the Verse, is one of my favorites. And for those of you that don't know it, it begins, they fuck you up, your mom and dad, they don't mean to, but they do. And, you know, I love that poem, right? I mean, it was for many reasons, right? I love the poem because of what it does, but also, like, cusses in it, you know? So when I heard that, I was like, wow, you can say that kind of thing in a poem? Wow. And it rhymes. So this is my version of it. It's called This Be the Verse, and it's got an epigraph from Radiohead. It's one of my favorite bands. It is the 21st century. This is the skin they put me in, my mom and dad. Remixed melanin oleo for the asthmatic and colorblind. See how it bronzes on command. See how my hybrided daughter looks darker while on the beach with me. If my skin was a chicken wing, I'd lick my eyebrows before code switching inflections. If my skin was a woman, I'd check my leopard print steering wheel at the door. I'd transform my crust of rust and sea salt into something more 21st century. Borges said things belong to the past quite quickly, so I'd throw some butane on my funk transistors, face paint my brown Band-Aid convocation, and toss my sweaty Free South Africa muscle shirt to the crowd in the recycling bin. I'd leave it to the Ghetto Fabulous to ID the magical backspin of skin. One day, I'll be a grumpy British guy. So while I was in Marfa doing my residency, I had a great pleasure of going up to McDonald Observatory, which is 45 minutes away. And I went up there for these things that they called star parties. And the star party, the night I went, it was kind of a bad party because the moon was out. And so you couldn't see anything really because of the moon. And the astronomers that were up there were really kind of disappointed. They're like, well, we're going to turn the telescope away from the moon, and all you're going to get to see is Saturn. Sorry. Are you kidding me? So I went and, I got, these enormous telescopes. I went and I looked at Saturn, and I saw it in, real time. There it was in black and white. And I could see the Cassini divisions, which are the spaces between the rings. And I got back about 1 o'clock, and I stayed up until 6 in the morning writing these poems that ended up being my new book. So I think I'm going to read all poems I wrote while I was there, except for the last one, which I just finished recently. There's only, I think, maybe 5 of them. This is called Unfunky UFO, 1981. And for those of you that know Parliament Funkadelic, that's the name of one of their songs. Not the 1981 part, just Unfunky UFO. The first space shuttle launch got delayed until Sunday, so we watched the shuttle's return in class instead. PS-113's paunchy black and white rolled in and its antennas adjusted sideways and down for better reception, so the TV set looked like a teenager after his love letter got returned to sender. That same day, Garrett stole my pencil box. That same day, Cynthia peed her jeans instead of letting Garrett steal her pencil box. Both of us, too upset to answer questions about spaceflight, so we got sent to the back of the class. Me smelling like the kind of shame that starts bar fights on Tuesday afternoons. She smelled like pee and denim. The shuttle made its slick way back to Earth, peeling clouds from the monochromatic sky, and we all, even the back of the bus and astronomically marginal, were winners. American, because a few days before, a failed songwriter put a bullet in the president in the name of Jodie Foster. The shuttle looked like a bullet, only with wings and a cockpit, and when it landed, the class broke into applause, and the teacher snatched a thinning American flag from the corner, waved it back and forth in honor of the president and those astronauts. Probably should have said, I think the book is going to be called Map to the Stars. This poem's called Map to the Stars. A Schwinn ride away, Eagledale Plaza, shopping strip of busted walkways, crooked parking spaces nicked like the lines in somebody's mom-barbered head. Anchored by the Piccadilly Disco, where a shootout was guaranteed every weekend. Those gun claps, coughing stars shot from sideways guns, shiny enough to light the way for anyone willing to keep a head up long enough to see. Not me. I bought the Star Map shirt for 15 cents at the Value Village next to the Piccadilly during the daytime. The shirt was polyester with flyaway collars outlined in the forgotten astronomies of disco. The shirt's washed out points of light arranged in horse and hero shapes, and I rocked it in places neither horse nor hero hung out. Polyester is made from polyethylene and catches fire easily like wings near a thrift store sun. Polyethylene used in shampoo bottles, gun cases, and those grocery sacks skidding like upended stars across the parking lot. There are more kinds of stars in this universe than salt granules on drive-through fries. Too many stars, lessening and swelling with each pedal pump away from the Value Village as the electric billboard above flashes first one DUI attorney and then another who speaks Spanish, so the sky above is constantly chattering like the biggest disco ball ever. So if it's not starting to become clear, what I realized is I was writing about astronomy, but I'm really writing about how poor we were when I was a kid. It's amazing how those two things intersect. You know, looking at the stars is free, right? And so we did that a lot when I was a kid. This is going to sound like the worst transition ever, but this next poem is called End of Side A, and it was inspired by the Rolling Stones. Exile on Main Street, which is one of my favorite records. And I do mean record. Like the cover of that, if you all know, is this really crazy montage of sideshow entertainers. End of side A. It ends because the beginning won't jumpstart again. Red smudge of a mouth, lipstick everywhere like the afterthought a comet leaves on its way out. What makes this moment unfold like a fine woman raising herself up off the bathroom floor? Honky-tonk in the honeyed brown of an eyeball, perfume in its circus of heart-shaped introductions. It ends because the needle always winds up in the lead-out like a man pawing around for his broken spectacles after he wakes in the world's rubble. Hand over hand he paws through stilted guitar picks and abandoned stilettos, raised skirts and rocks glasses as chipped and smudged as the topography of a skipping record. He could be Ivan Albright himself, foraging the still life swish of low-rise tutus and skyscrapers cracked in the twisted aftermath of a smile. Even without glasses, he remembers her in high style, magnanimously coming down the blue and violet threads of night, her green dress clashing with the bathroom tile. I think I'm just going to read two more of these. I'm going to read part of a very long poem that I think is going to be the sort of center of the book, and it's called The Antique Blacks. And I dedicated it to Sun Ra, the jazz musician, Richard Pryor, and Guy S. Bluford, who was the first African-American to actually make it into outer space. He wasn't the first astronaut. He was just the first person to actually get up there. I'll maybe just read two parts of this, and then there's a part about Richard Pryor that I want to read too. Maybe I'll read his part first. The great thing about long poems in sections is it doesn't matter how they're organized. It's just all over the place. Right, so this is a direct thing from Richard Pryor, and for those of you that he did a skit on his show where he was the first black president. This is a theme today. And they asked him about funding NASA. So Richard Pryor, as the first black president, is asked about funding NASA. And this is what he said. He said, "We're going to send explorer ships through other galaxies, and no longer will they have the same types of music, Beethoven, Brahms, and Tchaikovsky. From now on, we're going to have a little Miles Davis, some Charlie Parker. We're going to have some different kinds of things in there." All lowercase things in here, all spacing things in here, and those words, that vernacular hubbub and that code switching tripping on curbs and triplicate, 3 fingers on the piano keys, 3 huffed up hopes on the upswing of Indianapolis's west side. Words work the fast magic like a magician's fingers fanned out as a W. Tingling fingers over here, white chickens pecking in the rain's wrists over there, building a nest egg over every great crescendo of wing-dropping G. This is the G-dropping vernacular they put me back in. This is the polyphone where my head was an agrarian gang sign pointing to like a percussion mallet to a corn maze in one of the smaller towns in Indiana. Be cool and try to grin it off. Be cool and try to lean it off. I'm grinning this vernacular like the bass drum smiles in a patriotic marching band. Be cool and try to ride the beat the same way me, Pryor, Ra, and Bluford did driving across the 30th Street Bridge, laughing at 2 big-headed dudes peeing into the water and looking at the stars. Right before the cop hit his lights. Face in the car, fingers locked behind your heads. Right after the patriotic fireworks started to pop off. Do I need to call the drug dog? Right after the rattling windows, the mosquitoes as busy in my ears as the 4th of July traffic cops. Right before the thrill of real planets and pretend planets spun high into the sky. Ra throwing up 3 West Side fingers, each ringed by the bursting gold pyrotechnics, and the misnomer of the 3 of us grinning at a billy cup waiting to downswing. Because fireworks light up the same way colors do in a billy club and rough knuckle-ups if you don't duck on the double. Because the west side of Indianapolis can be more patriotic than any part of Earth Voyager saw when it snapped its blue picture on the way out of the heliosphere. And there's like 9 more pages of that. So if it didn't make entire sense, I hope one day that the whole thing will. But that leads me to the last one of these poems that I'm going to read, and it's called Interstellar Space. And I'm really enamored with the Voyager 1, right? So you think about this in 1977, they throw this probe out there, and if you've ever seen it, it's like a, it's like a DirecTV dish with some antennas and this nuclear reactor that's attached but moved out on an arm so that it won't affect the transmissions. And this is high-tech stuff, right? And inside of it, there's a thing called the Sounds of Earth, and that's this gold record that has, Mozart and Bach and babies crying and cows. It's all these things that we wanted someone who might encounter this to know about Earth. I'm really interested in what that would be like now. What would we put on it today? I bet the Pygmy initiation songs wouldn't have made the cut. So this is called Interstellar Space. And it's got a quote at the beginning that maybe I should explain. This is the quote. NASA's Voyager 1 spacecraft officially is the first human-made object to venture into interstellar space. The 36-year-old probe is about 12 billion miles from our sun. So what happened, and this was in 2013, so 36 years after they threw this thing out into the universe, it finally left our solar system. What they figured out is that they thought the solar system ended around Pluto, which is no longer a planet, but they thought that might be the end of the solar system. But there's 14 more years of solar system after that. There's nothing out there, but it still has the same gravitational pull and all these other things. And so it took 14 years to finally get Voyager 1 out past the reach of our sun, of the heliosphere. So interstellar space. Oh, and when it was leaving, they turned it around and had it take a picture of the Earth. And so it's just this little blue dot in the corner of this picture. Interstellar space. After all the sonic quiet and static lead-in of earthly atmosphere, the moon is the same shape as a record, which is shaped the same as the luminous afro framing some future astronaut's face, like an arpeggio of stars would if stars were hollowed like the half notes ascending from Earth's rough creeks and broken trees, and a little girl running through a quick split of wobbly sunlight, and the vanity and redbirds flocking skyward like a chorus of singing mouths. instead of this incandescent sun having itself outside of a space probe on its ungainly way from here to whatever waits after the needy gravity and humidity of this place. They all rise like that. Round barometers, suns, black astronauts, Mozart's gauzy gyre of birds. A mother bent through the gauze to kiss her girl below a red and orange arabesque of leaves. All lathed on the gold record spinning inside Voyager 1 as it finally makes its way out of this high-maintenance heliosphere, radio antenna as pointed as the needle in the 14-year lead-out of the recordable world. Yeah. So we'll leave all that interstellar stuff behind, and I'm just going to read for the rest of the time. I'm going to read poems from The Big Smoke. And all of the poems I'm going to read are in the voice of Jack Johnson. Thank you again for that wonderful introduction, Dan. She touched on some of the stuff that I would have said, and I know you remember all the things she said about Jack Johnson at this point. But I'll just recap a couple of them. So he became heavyweight champion in 1908. He was, of course, the first African-American heavyweight champion. His parents were slaves. So he's the first generation after emancipation. Right? So you can imagine this world where people thought his parents weren't even human. People owned his parents, and he becomes the first heavyweight champion of the world. In this same time, boxing, it wasn't like it is now, where people don't really pay attention to it. Boxing was the sort of the center of sports back then. So if you're the heavyweight champion, you're basically the toughest person in the world. And that's the way that they looked at this. So it's going to cause problems if the toughest person in the world is an African American, right? It's going to cause even more problems when the toughest person in the world is an African American with gold teeth and who's married to a white woman, who's got 2 white mistresses, and who wears all these fancy clothes and drives around in fast cars. All of these things that you are not supposed to do. Basically, he's a 21st century athlete, but he's doing this in 1910. You know, it is amazing that he made it, that somebody didn't kill him. And one of the things that I don't think I did a good job of in this book is making clear the fact that he could have been murdered any day. Any day he walked out of his house, somebody could have murdered him, and whoever did the murdering would have gotten drinks bought for him. They would have never gotten convicted for it. It would have been a celebration in some parts of the United States. Now, this isn't everybody, of course, right? But it was enough people. And so his life was in danger every single time he got into the ring. So I think about that, and I think, man, you know, he's a flawed human being like all of us are, and there are these other things that are really difficult to negotiate about his biography and his behavior. But just on a fundamental, like, level of courage, you know, like I talk stuff. I was talking about how if I met Spike Lee, I'd have all these things I'd want to say to him, but that's just talk. You know, most of us think we're more brave and more courageous than we actually are. So, all the poems I'm going to read are in Jack Johnson's voice. Battle Royale. Back then, they'd chain a bear in the middle of the bear garden and let the dogs loose. Iron chains around a bear's neck don't slow him too much. A bear will always make short work of a dog. Shakespeare said Sackerson did it more than 20 times to dogs and wildcats alike, and since most creatures are naturally afraid of bears, there wouldn't always be much of a show in the bear garden. So the handlers sometimes put the bear's eyes out or took his teeth to make the fight more sporting. I believe you need eyes more than you need teeth in a fight, but losing either makes a bear a little less mean. Once baiting was against the law, some smart somebody figured coloreds would fight just as hard if hungry enough. So they rounded up the skinniest of us, had us stripped to trousers, then blindfolded us before the fight. They turned us in hard circles a few times on the ring steps like a motor car engine before pushing us between the ropes. When the bell rang, it seemed like I got hit from 8 directions. I didn't know where those punches came from, but I swung so hard my shoulder hadn't been right since, because the man said only the last darky on his feet gets a meal. Prize fighter. I love horses because they will outrun the fastest man. They are majestic, as stately as a Saturday woman before a party. Horses smell like what it means to be fast, sweat and gravel kicked up on early morning runs, the in and out of breath like gravel in tired lungs. I groomed and raced horses from Texas to Philadelphia until one broke my leg bone with a back kick. Thanks to that break, I can't ride anymore, and even if I could, we got these automobiles now, and they can carry us a mile a minute. I'm buying the fastest one I can find when I get my money together. I'm like an automobile in the ring. My fists work like cranked up engines. I've got the kind of elasticity other fighters dream about when I put them to sleep on the canvas. When I clinch a man, it's like being swaddled in forgiveness. When I hook a man, it's like being hit by frustration. I can't tell if horses are happy or confounded by this new means of locomotion, but I can say with certainty my prize-fighting cohorts are decidedly dissatisfied by my presence. The title of this poem comes from a quote in the New York Times. Machine containing Johnson's friends wrecked. They used to call cars back then pleasure machines. I'm so skilled with these machines, I've got a patent on a wrench that's only good for fixing my flyer. Moriarty knew he had no more chance of keeping up with me in a race than a turtle has of catching a Bakersfield jackrabbit. Bell and the rest of the girls believed his fast talk, and they piled into his auto like a congregation into a church. I was in the lead from the start, but I knew Moriarty was close because I could hear the girls cheering him on. I had my driving glasses on, and I'm seeing things the faster I go. A warm pail of water on a porch in Galveston, thunder clouds over Blaurat, soft like the mattresses at the Everly Club. A canvas as clean as Saturday washing except for a wet outline, a sweat angel on the spot Tommy Burns might have dropped if I'd let him fall. I wiped the dirt from my glasses in time to see a rabbit hurrying across the road and pulled hard on the brake. That's when Moriarty tried to pass. His wheels skidded on gravel and his back axle snapped like a rib. I've wrecked many machines and walked away whole, but this was different. The wheels of his auto unhinged and Moriarty's motor car smashed into the back of mine. I wasn't familiar with the girl sitting beside him, but she flew past us all, past me, past the still hurrying rabbit, past my mama's water pail back home that couldn't move even if it wanted to. So Jack Johnson was the person that basically innovated talking trash. And back then they used to call it mouth fighting, which seems much more appropriate than talking trash. Mouth fighting. Sometimes the fight is over before we even split the ropes. A fighter's glass jaw, the cut of his costume, the absence of pretty women in his entourage, all fair game for the mouth fight. Never mothers or children, never wives or crippled relatives, or women at all unless they're sporting women. There is always something else to talk about. A civilized mouth fight is about making a fighter wild, and as soon as I can tell he's listening, I know I've won. How are you supposed to defense when you're trying to get at me at any means necessary? Yellow fighters like Tommy Burns want to tear out when the talk starts. You can see their knees knocking as clearly as spoons in a vaudeville show. Others lose composure, and that's when it's over. That's why the mouth is the most devastating weapon, and mine shines to high heaven every time I take a swing. This has another title from a newspaper. It's called A Great Maltese Cat Toying with a White Mouse. And that's how one reporter described this fight that's on right now with Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns. A great Maltese cat toying with a white mouse. It's in 2 sections. What I told the reporters. I had no doubt about the outcome after the first round. The only surprise was how long Tommy Burns stayed on his feet. He was a game man and showed no inclination whatsoever to quit. My fists were better in every round, and I landed punches I thought would bring him down, but like a great pachyderm, he refused to stop. And because he was so game, I was glad the police ended the fight. I wanted to be heavyweight champion of the world, not injure Burns seriously. what I really meant. That man made me chase him from Texas to England and then all the way to Australia before he would fight me. Coward. He didn't win the title. He just happened to be white and in the right place like somebody striking gold. I put him down, but gently in the first round so he'd know what was to come when he got his knee off the canvas. Once he collected himself, I bruised him with my right and talked to him all the while. Walk right into it, Tommy. Left hook to the gut. That's right, Tommy. Straight right to the cheek. Take your medicine nicely. This is called Alias, and it's a sonnet made up all of names that Jack Johnson was called in the newspaper. Alias. John Arthur Johnson, Jack Johnson. Lil Arthur, Jack Johnson. Tiny's boy Jack. Yellow streak nigga. Bold Mr. Johnson, Jack Johnson. The Big Smoke, Jack Johnson. Flash nigga, Jack Johnson. The Big Cinder, Black Animal, Jack. Texas Watermelon Pickaninny, Mr. Johnson. Colored man with cash, colored champion, the colored winner, Gentleman Jack, Jack Johnson. Galveston Giant, the heavyweight champion, Smoke. The Big Ethiopian, Fresh nigga, the man they all dodge, Papa Jack, Champion Jack, Johnson, Papa Jack. I mentioned that he had gold teeth, which is awesome. And this poem is called Gold Smile. His favorite author was Shakespeare, so there's an epigraph from Shakespeare at the beginning. Teeth hadst thou in thy head when thou was born, to signify thou camest to bite the world. And that's from Henry VI. They call teeth dent in France, and the name makes sense the way teeth do what they do to bacon and shoulders and cakes. The French word for gold is or, so when the folks in Paris describe my smile, it sounds like what would happen when I punch a door. Dense door. Dense door, the French children say when I open wide. Dense door, Etta says when she locked herself in the powder room. Tommy Burns said dense door when I was hooking him into asking for forgiveness. His people back in Canada would have said the exact same thing if they were in Sydney to witness our spectacle. Before we got into the ring, I told Tommy the only reason I got these gold uppers is to make every bite of my food twice as expensive. This is the theme today, the motif. A struggle between a demon and a gritty little dwarf. That's how a reporter described this fight that you're watching right now. The longer the fight lasts, the more the moving picture rights are worth. That's the reason I kept Ketchel off the canvas. He might have called himself the assassin, but I played with him in the ropes like a cat does a mouse, lacing him just enough to bring blood for the show. That's what prize fighting is, a show. The better man almost always wins, and we all play our parts in the spectacle. Ketcher's handlers dressed him up as a part of a heavyweight using high boots and extra coats, but underneath it all, he was strictly a middleweight. And I picked him up, held him high so his feet dangled like a Sunday chicken on that special morning. Then I smiled at the only colored in the crowd, hatless next to all those whites in their bowlers and bright ribboned fedoras. I heard Ketchel's second slap the canvas and yell, "Now then, Stanley," but I didn't see the double cross until Ketchel's hook stung me behind the ear. I dropped, stopped my fall with a glove before I hit the canvas. The referee started counting, and the buzzing sounds started inside my ears like a crowd before the fight. All those spectators hoping Ketchel would put me down. The crowd quieted when I smiled my gold smile and punched the dust off my gloves. Quiet enough to hear me hit Ketchel so hard we both fell down. Quiet enough to hear the 1, 2, 3 of his teeth hitting the canvas like chicken scratch. 2 of his uppers got stuck in my glove. Quiet as Ketchel sprawled like he was counting the clouds, the referee counting slowly for fear of his own skin. I didn't show that I was scared, but I was. I leaned casually on that top rope, waiting for a twitch, a breath, any sign the man would be a man again. This poem is called Rememory. I probably should, if I didn't mention it, I don't think I did. Jack Johnson's wife's name was Etta, so she pops up in the next couple of poems that I'm going to read. Rememory. I've forgotten some prize fights and the names of men I beat more than they beat me. But how can I forget that horse divine intervention with a scar dividing my thigh like Wabash splits Chicago? That horse back kicked so hard my leg bone broke, split my skin like a lazy plum. I laid back in that stall bleeding and hollering in the dirty hay. And with that horse looking over his shoulder at me like it was my fault. And the flies humming, stuttering like telegraph type until Jim found me. I couldn't tolerate horses after that. The scar is purple now and jagged as a pants hem. Even though the bone healed all right, I rub the scar for luck. Most times, I forget I'm rubbing it until Etta reminds me. So for those of you that know Leadbelly, the blues musician Leadbelly, he's got this great song, The Titanic. And in the song, Jack Johnson is doing a little dance because the Titanic went down and he was refused passage on it. So the captain, Captain Smith of the Titanic, said no. And in the song, in the folklore of it, Jack Johnson's like, whew, you know, and he's doing a little dance on the dock when he finds this out. Now, the more I did research on Jack Johnson, the more I realized there is no way in the universe that this man would have overtly celebrated the death of so many people. I don't even think he would have done it internally, but certainly no gentleman stands around doing a little dance when people have died. And that's the thing that Jack Johnson wanted to be. He wanted to be a gentleman. Everything about him was geared toward this, you know, European turn of the century idea of what a gentleman is. So this is called Ticket on the Titanic. Etta and I had no intention of missing the maiden voyage of the finest ship built by man, but Captain Smith drew the color line almost as quickly as Tommy Burns did. I expect the line from a frightened prize fighter, but from an English sea captain, he should be more principled, especially after I offered $4,000 for each ticket. Of course, that color line kept me from fighting for Etta's space on the lifeboat when the iceberg hit. That's a fight you can bet your last copper I would have won. Even after all the offense I suffered and the indignity of being refused passage, I would have never danced the Eagle Rock after all those people drowned. This is going to be the last poem that I read, and thank you for listening and for having me here. I love Santa Fe. I would move into that space I'm staying in right now. Like, I don't eat much. I could live there. This is called Il Trovatore, after Verdi's opera, which was Jack Johnson's favorite piece of music. Il Trovatore. The first time I heard the aria, it was like sunup after the great storm, the woman's voice rising, then rising more, as if the want of it all wouldn't allow her another breath. Like road work when you've punched yourself out. Like Tommy Burns catching my gut hook. Like the first I saw of Etta. Like the sound of the crowd in Reno when Jeffries couldn't go on. Like going up the steps of the Cafe de Champion after a crash of gunshots in Etta's room. Like finding Etta on the floor, a hail of blood getting bigger by the minute. Like the nurses not nursing but crying and pointing at the gun still hot in Etta's own hands. Like realizing Etta's still breathing, whispering a libretto on the heels of her last breath. You did this, Papa. You did this. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm trying to figure out where I should stand.
I think you should stand here.
Just stand.
Yeah. So, if anyone has any questions, Adrian will attempt to answer them. And I will bring you the microphone.
It's like a gift basket, except you have to talk in it.
I have a question.
Okay.
It's not exactly about the poems, but I'm very curious about this. You know, in watching those films, you just get the impression that if Jack Johnson had wanted to, he would have just eviscerated all of those guys in the ring, like in the first round. So did he hold back on purpose?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, you could see particularly, I mean, maybe, yeah, in both of those, with Tommy Burns and with Stanley Ketchel, he's so much bigger than they are. I mean, never mind the fact that he's more skilled in the ring. I mean, he's so much bigger than them. And you know, he could have very easily knocked them out. And but part of, actually we were talking about this earlier, part of the way he made money was through these tours with the film. So these clips that you saw are parts of longer fight films. And they would take these fight films from town to town and charge a nickel for people to watch them. And it's like pay-per-view. Nobody wants to watch a one-round fight. You don't want to spend $75 on a one-round fight. You know, you want to get your money's worth. And so they all knew this. And when there would be somebody so unevenly matched, so completely, so obviously over, in these positions that Johnson would be, he would just carry them. He'd carry the fight. So he would let them stay up till the 5th or 6th round, you know. And so he got this, well, all of them, many of the great heavyweights at this time got these reputations of kind of not trying very hard. But that's not actually true. They were trying really hard. They were just trying hard to make money, not trying hard to win the fight. So yeah, he could have very easily knocked them out. You know, I was in Cleveland a couple of weeks ago, and I did a reading in a boxing gym, and there was this boxing trainer, this old boxing trainer who was really, one of those kind of like this Yoda of boxing trainers. He's really great. And I was talking to him, and he told me that he shows his fighters clips of Jack Johnson and Jack Dempsey and these fighter Joe Louis, these early boxers, because their defense, their sense of the ring was more pure than fighters are now, because there wasn't always that impulse to try to knock people out. And I don't want to get too far into the boxing part of it, because I know not everybody is a fan of boxing, but you know, Mike Tyson basically destroyed boxing, not from his behavior outside of the ring, but because he was so good and because he was so vicious. He would go in, knock somebody out in a minute and a half with all these pyrotechnics, and then when someone wanted to come in and box, like Floyd Mayweather, who never knocks anybody out, that seemed less interesting than seeing somebody get crushed the way that Mike Tyson would. Nobody before Tyson was like that. Ali wasn't like that. George Foreman was. I mean, he was a heavy. None of these boxers before him would come in and just destroy people that quickly. And once that template was set, you know, in the culture that we live in with video games and, you know, all of these the ways that people entertain themselves, it's like that immediacy. And so a real boxer, someone who, like Jack Johnson, who's thinking about defense and thinking about the ways in which you negotiate a fight without getting hit, you know, that doesn't really fly anymore. So this trainer was talking about the way he would show Johnson, and he said in no uncertain terms that Johnson would have beat Ali, would have beat Tyson, would have beat any of them because they wouldn't have been able to hit him. And so, you know, that was music to my ears. I don't know if it's true, but I was like, you're right, he would have. He could have beat anybody. And I'm a huge fan of Ali. I just, this guy was doing a very different thing.
Questions?
We got this covered. It's like front and.
So I'm wondering, having looked at the films while you were reading the poems, so many of them were in Jack Johnson's voice, and I was wondering what the process was like watching the films and going from you watching them and thinking, he's doing this, he's doing that, to getting into his head, and whether it was, I mean, were you already in his head before you worked with the films, or no? Yeah,
that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. I mean, you know, I'm trying to think of a really short way to answer it, because I worked on this book for 8 years, and so there were many different parts of the process. And, you know, I researched Johnson and his life and the time that he lived in for about 2 years before I ever wrote a poem. And so I had this very defined sense of what I thought his voice was. You know, and I mean, and I also had the benefit that he's got a pretty extensive archive. I mean, there are interviews, there are a few audio recordings of him. Like this has audio. At the very end, you get to hear him talking. But there's a fairly extensive textual archive for Johnson. He wrote 2 autobiographies, but the autobiographies were ghostwritten by a French guy and then translated into English. So he didn't really write them, you see what I mean? But so there were all these texts that were purporting to be Jack Johnson's voice. And so I spent a great deal of time trying to triangulate what I thought he would sound like from these ghost-written texts, from the things that I knew were directly his voice, and then also these newspaper interviews where they would sometimes render him directly, but other times they would turn him into this kind of minstrel figure, where, I shows is happy to be heavyweight champion, this kind of stuff, when he would have never, anyway, so there were these different kinds of pieces that I was trying to put together. I didn't allow myself to watch the fight films. I didn't allow myself to watch anything that wasn't related to him talking until I had what I thought was his voice for the book. I wanted to have that down before I opened up the rest of it. And what's really crazy, so 8 years I was researching that whole time. I was writing the poems, continuing to research, finding new sources. And 3 weeks ago, I found an unpublished autobiography that Jack Johnson wrote while he was in prison. So 8 years, I'm on it, thinking I thoroughly, researched this dude. Nobody was going to show up and say, that's not true, because I'd covered all my bases. And then I find this, he wrote it while he was in Leavenworth. It's on Leavenworth Penitentiary stationery. It's all handwritten. It's only 50 pages long, where he goes through and he talks about these things. I was terrified. I've been transcribing it, and I was completely terrified because I knew what I was going to find in this text was going to show that my idea of who he was wrong, but in fact it was pretty close to what I had imagined. And all the way down to, in the book, I use ampersands because I thought they looked cool. They looked, not for any particular, poetic reason. No, that's not true. They actually represent, I think it was, the pose of the boxer. No, I just think that they look great. And I get this autobiography, and he used ampersands too. And so then, I'm telling the truth now, but from now on, I'm going to integrate into my nonsense that I noticed in his writings that he used ampersand, so I wanted to do it too. So I dodged a bullet basically. This is a little bit off the subject, but a similar kind of concern. I read that poem about the Titanic, and all the way up until the week I was supposed to send the manuscript, the final manuscript in to Penguin, I had that poem talking about how Jack Johnson was going to punch his way onto this lifeboat, and he and Ada were going to get on there. They weren't going down with the ship. They would have been on their way. And I was really proud of this. I'm like, yeah, that's telling him Jack Johnson, It was like the universe stepped in somehow. I'm driving to my friend's house, NPR's on, and it was the anniversary of the Titanic sinking. And they had this long program on about the Titanic and how all the men that were on the Titanic went down with the ship. Because that's what a gentleman does, is allow the women and the children to go, and the men go down with the ship. There was only one man that got on a lifeboat, and he committed suicide 3 years later because every place he would go, people would shame him for not going down with the ship. So I'd been doing all this work, and I was so proud of this poem. I was like, yeah, he's talking trash. He's going to fight his way on that lifeboat, and it would have been completely wrong. And so at some point, I would have run across the person that was like the Titanic geek, in the back of the room. That poem's not true. And so I worked really hard to try to have that not happen. And it started with the voice. I wanted it to be as accurate as it could be to the text that I could find. Thank you for that question.
What year was he in Leavenworth?
He was there in 1920 and 1921. Mm-hmm. So he was, mentioned that I was, Dana mentioned that I'm working on a graphic novel. The graphic novels, I'm working on 2 of them, and one of them is finishing up Jack Johnson's story. When I was doing this research, I thought it was a 2-book project. I just didn't want to write 2 books of poems. And so the second part of it extends into his time in prison and what happened after. And so, he's really fascinating. There are some really tough issues to negotiate about domestic violence and things like that in his biography that pop up in the book. But just as a life, when you look at this, the first half of his life, he basically changed the world, right? Like he's changing the world. He's making people change around him. And then the government was like, all right, enough of that. And they convicted him of the Mann Act, which is transporting a woman across state lines for prostitution. And the kind of rationale was one of his mistresses was a prostitute. So like, well, even though he wasn't paying her, she was a prostitute, she went across state lines. And since he gave her, he sent her packing because his wife made him, and she was looking for an opportunity to get back at him. So that's how he ended up in prison to begin with. But before he went to prison, he went on the run. And he lived in France until World War I broke out. And he's over there hanging out with the surrealists and the Dadaists. He fought this exhibition with Arthur Craven that was actually this kind of big performance art piece. And he was going to become a French citizen. And then World War I broke out, and the French government was like, yes, we would love for you to be a French citizen, but you're going to have to fight in our army. And he was like, okay, I think it's time to move on. And he went to Spain, and he was there right around the rumblings of the Spanish Revolution. So then he went to Cuba, and then he went to Mexico and ended up in Mexico in the middle of the Mexican Revolution, going from one part of Mexico to the other, like hanging out with Emilio Zapata and part of it, and Pancho Villa and another part, and bouncing back and forth. And so he went from being this guy who changed the world in so many ways to being a person that was kind of being pushed around by world events. But he never changed his attitude. He thought he was changing things, but really he was no longer doing that. He eventually just ran out of money and turned himself in. And so, yeah, that was maybe a little bit longer than just the 1920, 21, but it's really fascinating to me. I keep trying to find maybe a more appropriate corollary, but the only person I can think of is like, and this, I don't mean this in any bad way, it's like Forrest Gump. You remember Forrest Gump? Like how he would just like go from one place to another and just be in the middle of stuff. All of a sudden he was Forrest Gump. He can't even spell, and he's sitting there meeting President Johnson or whatever. You know, he just would go from one place to the next and be in the middle of things. I mean, Jack Johnson was significantly more aware than a fictional character, but he just kind of bounced from one place to the next and ended up in the middle of things all the time. So that's what the graphic novel is exploring, as that time afterward. Thanks for that question.
Can you talk about your process with the graphic novel? Are you drawing it?
You know what, I am. We were talking about this. I am a horrible, horrible illustrator. Like, I'm like one click away from stick figures, you know. But I'm illustrating it because I want it to be. This is gonna make me sound like some kind of control freak, but I've talked to some different illustrators, and none of them have the background with Johnson and with the time that I do. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to lay these things out so that we can render it on some level accurately, still historically. I mean, this book it's made up, but not, right? I mean, it's a book of poetry. It's not a biography, but everything that happens in the book happened. So that, you know, so I want to show that respect to his story, and I couldn't figure out a way to convey this imagistically. So I'm doing this kind of hybrid collage and illustration. And when I get it done, then I'm going to turn it over to somebody who's significantly more talented than me. And
have you figured out how to convey the subtlety of the way that you write in the image?
you know, that was really hard. I've been working on this for about 8 years, and thanks for saying subtlety. That's very kind. I've been working on this for about 8 months, and I thought, I've been reading comics and graphic novels my whole life, so I thought, yeah, this is what I do. I'm a comic book geek. I should be able to do this no problem. It is so hard, particularly because I think about it like a poet. So the text comes first, and then whatever resultant picture comes from the text is inside the head of the reader, hopefully, right? And so so what I had to do was I had to rethink my process of writing entirely. So I've been writing it like a novel. And so Jack Johnson sounds like he does in the poems, but there are parts of it that are sort of first-person narration, and then there are others of them that are like third-person scenes where you just see dialogue. And so I've been going back and forth using different narrative devices to try to tell the story most robustly. You know, and it's important to still hear him because he was so out of touch with some of the things that were going on. Maybe one example of that. So he couldn't stand Joe Louis, you know, the great Joe Louis, who donated all of his winnings to the World War II war effort, and then the government taxed him anyway, and he spent the rest of his life trying to pay back the taxes on all this money that he donated to the war effort, right? He couldn't stand Joe Louis. But it wasn't Joe Louis's fault. Joe Louis's trainer told Jack Johnson to stay away. So Jack Johnson showed up and he's like, look, let me train him. I can teach him to be better defensively. And his trainer was like, we don't want any of your gallivanting with white women, gold teeth having nonsense around our fighter. He's a good American. And so Jack Johnson took that with him. For his entire life, he held on to this slight. So when Joe Louis is fighting Max Schmeling in these great battles, first time Schmeling won, and Joe Louis bet on Schmeling and won all this money. And he's in Harlem. Of all places, he's in Harlem, having won all this money from Joe Louis, this great American, losing. And he's in a bar trying to buy people drinks and doesn't understand why people are booing him and trying to get him out. So there was this point at which he just became so acutely unaware of what was going on in the world around him that it wouldn't serve to have his voice be the narration of it anymore. Because all it would be is I'm out of touch. And what I wanted it to be was hopefully more nuanced than that. No, thank you. And thanks for saying it so loud. It makes me feel good. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you again for coming and remind you to stay for our reception.
No, thank you so much. Thank you.